A train from the east thunders into Iranian territory, laden not just with goods, but with hope and the winds of change. With the opening of this new China-Iran logistics corridor, the threats attributed to figures like Trump regarding Iran effectively crumble. According to narratives associated with the Trump team, the US and Iran are supposedly close to reaching an agreement on the Iranian nuclear issue. If this were to materialize, it would be framed as a first substantial foreign policy achievement for such an administration. Consequently, it's viewed with considerable importance. Yet, even at the brink of a supposed agreement, the strategy often involves persisting with maximum pressure, with an unwillingness to ease sanctions as a sign of good faith. Administrations employing such tactics likely believe that continuous pressure and strict sanctions will completely eliminate Iran's leverage, allowing them to gain more in the final round of negotiations and force a full Iranian capitulation. However, calls for a more resolute and complete embargo on Iran, even using US military force to blockade all of Iran's external shipping lanes, are clearly just part of a maximum pressure rhetoric used for leverage. Such wishful thinking about maximum pressure is obviously unachievable. Just in the past couple of days, a freight train from China, filled with Chinese exports to Iran, traversed the railway networks of several Central Asian countries and rolled into Tehran station. This marks the first direct rail freight transport between China and Iran, opening a new route via China's western regions, the 5 Central Asian states, and then into Iran. Subsequently, this train will return to China laden with Iranian exports. Compared to traditional sea transport, the Iran Central Asia-China railway network can save half a month in transit time. More crucially, it's an entirely overland route, passing through countries that are not US allies, and the US has no means to militarily sever this transport link. Threats that if Iran doesn't reach an agreement with the US, America will impose even harsher blockades and stronger embargoes to completely destroy Iran's economy have naturally lost their sting with the opening of this new China-Iran logistics corridor. This unequivocally tells the United States that whether it's financial sanctions or military blockades, American hegemonic assertions are increasingly challenged. If the US wants to use financial hegemony to cut off other countries' trade lines, China has diversified payment and settlement solutions, including entities like Kunlun Bank. If the US wants to use military hegemony for maritime interdiction, China can also facilitate the movement of key products through non-shipping methods. For Iran, regardless of US sanctions, its ability to conduct normal trade with the world's largest industrial nation is a very important bargaining chip. Calculations for a major US victory based on such pressure are clearly set to become fantasy again. This attitude of disregarding US sanctions and threats also makes other countries aspiring to challenge the current international order feel both envious and uneasy. For instance, India, which fancies itself a South Asian power, has been paying particularly close attention to China's freight train arriving in Tehran. An Indian expert, writing in the Indian media outlet Eurasian Times, stated that this direct land-based trade between China and Iran is a huge challenge and a weakening of the US-constructed international system, especially the Indian Ocean system, severely diminishing the value of America's Indian Ocean strategy. Geographically, Iran is at the heart of the Asian continent, a natural link connecting the Middle East, Central Asia, and Europe. The opening of the China-Iran commercial railway allows Iran's unique geographical advantages to be fully realized. This railway line starts from China's vast inland regions, crosses the expansive deserts and grasslands of Central Asia, and finally reaches Iran, extending to various parts of Europe through Iran's existing rail network. Its completion marks the opening of a brand new trade corridor between China and Europe, more efficient and faster than traditional sea routes, injecting strong impetus into economic cooperation among countries along the route. Economically, the opening of the China-Iran commercial railway brings unprecedented development opportunities for both countries and the entire Eurasian continent. For China, this railway provides a new path for Chinese goods to enter the European market, significantly shortening transport times, reducing logistics costs, and enhancing the competitiveness of Chinese products in Europe. It also facilitates China's imports from Europe, promoting trade balance. For Iran, becoming an important gateway for China into Europe will greatly boost its economic development. Iran's abundant resources like oil, natural gas, and minerals can be more conveniently transported to China and other Asian countries via rail, opening up broader markets. Furthermore, the railway will attract more Chinese investment into Iran, driving the development of related industries like manufacturing, processing, and logistics, creating numerous jobs and promoting economic diversification. In the international trade landscape, the China-Iran commercial railway also has profound implications. It breaks the limitations of traditional trade routes, offering more choices for trade cooperation across Eurasia. This railway closely links countries along its path: China, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, etc., forming a vast economic cooperation zone, promoting optimal resource allocation and coordinated industrial development within the region. From a broader perspective, the China-Iran commercial railway is also a significant achievement of the Belt and Road Initiative. It further promotes connectivity among countries along the route, fosters exchange and cooperation between different civilizations, and contributes positively to building a community with a shared future for mankind. Iran seems to have made the right bet this time. After decades of US sanctions that nearly crippled its economy, it has finally found a beard daring enough to stand up to Washington. China not only buys its oil but also sells it much-needed industrial goods and technology. It's suggested that even drone parts blacklisted by the US might be covertly transported via this route. Tehran understands clearly, aligning with China means, at the very least, not having to take orders from the White House. As for America's maximum pressure, railways aren't warships. One can't just bomb the tracks. Such overland connections also make other countries around Iran, especially in the Middle East, realize they can establish direct land links with China without US interference, free from concerns about American blockades, and thereby deepen their relations with China. Compared to China, India is geographically closer but lacks China's capability to strategize and effectively counter US hegemony in this manner. This is a source of dismay for India. Indians are likely not just considering America's position, but also their own Indian Ocean ambitions being disrupted. After all, some in India have long fantasized about using the North Indian Ocean shipping lanes as a crucial bargaining chip in a future conflict with China, employing their Navy and Air Force to blockade these routes, thereby cutting off China's shipping with the Middle East and Europe and forcing concessions on key issues. Although this itself is a pipe dream, the opening of the China-Iran rail link has served as a wake-up call for more Indians. Therefore, for China, this new freight train traveling overland into Iran symbolizes much more than just breaking the current US blockade on Iran. It also symbolizes China's capability to break potential future US blockades against China itself. In terms of transport capacity, Central Asian rail transport certainly cannot compare to Indian Ocean maritime shipping. But at critical moments, it can at least maintain China's most crucial supply lines for goods and energy, free from the threat of powerful adversaries, allowing normal transport and exchange with everything west of Malacca. The value of this alone, as some Indians might observe, is worth ignoring so-called US sanctions and prohibitions. Perhaps most awkwardly for India, it originally intended to connect with Central Asia by investing in Iran's Chabahar port. However, due to perceived deference to the US, it hesitated to proceed. Now China might integrate Pakistan's Gwadar port with Iran, effectively outmaneuvering India in its own perceived sphere of influence. The Modi government is now in a dilemma, aligning too closely with the US risks losing geopolitical leverage, while cooperating with China and Iran risks offending its Western partners. Thus, the price of strategic hesitation is watching your opponent make their move. However, the US will certainly not sit idle by. It has recently sanctioned a batch of Chinese companies involved in China-Iran trade. Next, it will likely try to coerce or entice transit countries like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan to create obstacles. But the problem is, which Central Asian country doesn't want to earn transit fees? China is linking them all with its transformative railway network. How can the US compete with mere empty promises? Even more ironically, the more the US sanctions entities involved in China-Iran cooperation, the closer they may huddle together. This might even draw Russia and Turkey into this land power alliance. At that point, US hegemony might truly become riddled with holes. The core of this game is actually the century-old contest between land power and sea power. The US has dominated for decades with aircraft carriers and maritime transport. But now, China is weaving a terrestrial network of railways, pipelines, and ports that the US Navy cannot easily reach. Iranian oil via rail is just the beginning. In the future, African aluminum and Central Asian natural gas could replicate this model. When more countries discover they can thrive without relying on traditional US dollar-denominated systems, Washington's sanctions cudgel will start to rust. Okay, here's the translated and polished English version of the commentary. Modi, flushed with victory. India pushes for more S-400s, upgraded BrahMos, and a homegrown 5th-gen fighter. Following the end of a recent Indo-Pak conflict, India has been remarkably active in the defense industry. It's unclear if this flurry of activity is driven by the need to replenish stocks after combat or if Prime Minister Modi, perhaps buoyed by a sense of victory, believes India is now capable of simultaneously launching multiple major defense projects. Indian media reported on May 26 that India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval is scheduled to visit Moscow next week for face-to-face talks with Russian Defense Minister Shoigu. The agenda includes urging Russia to expedite the delivery of the remaining 2 S-400 missile system sets and potentially to procure several more. On the same day, other Indian reports indicated that negotiations have begun with Russia to develop an upgraded version of the BrahMos missile, with Russia guaranteeing full technical support. While specific technical specifications haven't been revealed, it's expected to be more potent than the current BrahMos, implying a range exceeding 290 to 400 kilometers and a speed greater than Mach 2.8. India has already planned to construct a new factory for the research, development, and production of this new missile. On May 27th, Indian Defence Minister Rajnath Singh formally approved the development framework for India's 5th-generation stealth fighter, the AMCA Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft. The AMCA project will reportedly be spearheaded by India's Aeronautical Development Agency ADA for prototype development, with Hindustan Aeronautics Limited held responsible for manufacturing. Several private companies are also expected to be involved, following what's described as an Indian-style public-private partnership model for 5th-gen fighter development. According to the Indian Ministry of Defence and previous sources, the timeline for AMCA is very aggressive, requiring its first flight before 2029, with some even suggesting it will enter service by that year. In short, India's 5th-gen fighter project, after much deliberation, finally seems to be underway. However, the head of the Indian Air Force IAF, the Chief of Air Staff, has voiced concerns about delays in major defense procurement projects. Shortly after the AMCA approval, he reportedly made a pessimistic remark: almost no military procurement project is completed on time. This begs the question, why sign the contract then? He likely understands better than anyone that given the LCA Tejas fighter took 40 years to barely enter service while being significantly outdated, India is highly unlikely to complete 5th-gen fighter development within 10 years. The design standards for the LCA Tejas were initially very high. India envisioned it as a standout among 3rd-generation fighters, comprehensively outperforming the F-16, MiG-29, and Mirage 2000. The project was also intended to establish a complete military aviation industry, thereby ending the IAF's reliance on imported main combat equipment. The original plan was for a 10-year development cycle, with squadron service by 1994. In reality, the entire process was fraught with unexpected setbacks and chaos. By the time this 3rd-generation fighter entered service in 2016, the world had already transitioned to the era of 5th-generation fighter dominance. India publicly claims the LCA is an indigenously developed, fully domestic aircraft. However, its localization rate is reportedly less than 50%, with almost all key equipment sourced from abroad. Its airframe bears a strong resemblance to France's Dassault Mirage series high-aspect ratio delta wing, no horizontal tail, and indeed, Dassault was deeply involved in its design. The initial plan was to use a US General Electric F-404 engine, later switching to the Indian-developed Kaveri afterburning turbofan engine after 7 years. But India severely underestimated the difficulty of developing aero engines. The Kaveri project, initiated in 1984, remains unqualified to this day, despite India continually raising performance requirements. even ambitiously aiming for thrust vectoring technology. The R&D effort ultimately collapsed under chaotic direction. Even the improved LCA variants rely on the General Electric F-1 for engine. Furthermore, its scanning radar and radio systems are from Israel, the fire control radar from Sweden's Ericsson. Refueling probes, radomes, and ejection seats are imported from the UK, cockpit avionics are French, and the GSH-3L twin-barrel cannon is Russian. LCA Tejas specifications claimed versus reality: wingspan 8.2 meters, length 13.2 meters, height 4.4 meters, empty weight 6,560 kilograms, max takeoff weight 13,500 kilograms, max speed Mach 1.8, service ceiling 16,000 meters, range 1,700 kilometers, combat radius 500 kilometers. These figures are not necessarily reliable, not due to effective Indian secrecy, but because India's claimed data is often inflated, making external verification difficult. For instance, the claimed max speed of Mach 1.8 might actually be only Mach 1.4. Besides the Soviet-era 23mm twin-barrel GSH-3 cannon, it can carry various munitions on 8 external hardpoints. The LCA Tejas light combat aircraft can, at best, be considered a 3.5 generation fighter. Moreover, it cannot function as an air superiority fighter, only as a multi-role aircraft. Although it met the technical specifications set at its design inception, those were 1980s level specifications. A fighter with 1980s level performance entering service in 2016 is quite laughable, especially when China had already developed the J-20, a 5th generation stealth heavy fighter. With the LCA, India once again exposed its tendency to aim high but fall short, demonstrating overambition. The IAF once considered ordering 200 LCAs, but ultimately procured only a small number. Now, they are reportedly gritting their teeth to acquire French Rafales at a high price rather than giving the LCA another chance. The difficulty of India's 5th Gen AMCA project far exceeds that of the Tejas. 5th generation fighters require not only highly integrated avionics, advanced stealth materials, and sophisticated structural design, but also powerful data link integration capabilities and AI-assisted combat functions. India relies almost entirely on imports for these key technologies, or they are still in the laboratory stage. For example, India's AMCA plans to use the US-made F-1 for engine, but this engine has limited thrust and cannot support the supercruise capability essential for a 5th gen fighter. As for the indigenous Kaveri engine, it was a declared failure in the Tejas project, and a new generation power plant solution has yet to be determined. Furthermore, India heavily relies on Israel, France, and the UK for radar, stealth coatings, flight control software, etc., and these countries impose extremely strict technology transfer restrictions. The localization rate of India's aviation industry has long been below 50%, yet the AMCA project aims to increase it to over 70%. This lofty ambition, however, is not built on a solid industrial foundation. Hindustan Aeronautics Limited (HAL), the main manufacturing entity, has been plagued by frequent maintenance accidents and delivery delays in recent years, even earning derisive nicknames suggesting high attrition rates and poor quality control. More critically, India lacks systems engineering integration capabilities. Developing a modern 5th gen fighter is a massive and complex systems engineering undertaking, involving hundreds of subsystems, thousands of suppliers, and tens of thousands of technical specifications. India's manufacturing supply chain management and quality control levels are far from meeting the standards required. Meanwhile, Indian defense projects are notorious for 3 chronic problems: schedule delays, budget overruns, and unmet technical specifications. This makes external observers extremely pessimistic about its 5th gen fighter plan. The AMCA prototype's first flight was originally scheduled for 2017, now reportedly postponed to 2030, earlier stated as 2029, highlighting inconsistency. Even so, this timeline is very likely to slip again. Experts quip that if India's 4th gen fighter took 40 years to mass produce, the 5th gen might take 50. India's launch of the AMCA project is driven not only by military needs, but is also a product of geopolitical maneuvering. With Pakistan announcing the procurement of China's J-35A stealth fighter, India feels unprecedented strategic pressure. Once China's export-oriented 5th-gen fighter, the J-35, is delivered to Pakistan, the Pakistan Air Force (PAF) will possess a complete stealth strike capability, while India will still rely on aging Su-30MKs and a small number of Rafales. The Indian Air Force now seems to be in a no-win situation. Developing the AMCA, when they haven't even mastered 4th-gen fighters, will inevitably lead to significant delays. Buying the F-35A would likely have a similar acquisition timeline to the AMCA, and the two indigenous, foreign types would create logistical and operational conflicts. Buying the Su-57. That aircraft isn't widely considered a true 5th-gen fighter, at best something with performance approaching it. For India to upgrade it to a true 5th-gen standard, they would undoubtedly be severely overcharged. Contrast with Pakistan's approach. In contrast, Pakistan has taken a very solid and methodical path in the R&D and mass production of its 4th-generation fighter, the JF-17 Thunder Jalong. It was a step-by-step process, meeting its timelines. They equipped 4th-gen fighters when appropriate, and their JF-17 Block 3 of 4.5-gen aircraft wasn't far behind schedule. Moreover, China generously provided the PAF with the J-10CE, and both delivery and operational combat readiness were achieved quickly. Their timeline for equipping 4.5-gen fighters was only about a decade behind the Chinese Air Force. Consequently, the Pakistan Air Force is now very naturally transitioning towards 5th-generation fighters. Compared to the Indian Air Force, the PAF, with what the original text describes as China's hand-in-hand guidance, is far superior in terms of the scientific approach to equipment acquisition, an orderly procurement timeline, and modernization sequencing. A country that can't even properly manage a 3rd-generation light fighter yet vainly attempts to leapfrog the 5th-generation gap will only end up as another major laughingstock in the international defense industry. That's all for today's program. If you liked it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your engagement means a lot. See you next time.